Hello and welcome to the second of our second year with an analysis of the Parsha with a commentary of the Alshich Series. If you'd like to sponsor the share, then please send an email to yy@rabbiyyy, and I will be very happy to sponsor the share to mark a celebration in your life, a yort site, or any other good Jewish event you would like us to mention. Parshas Noach, obviously tons to say. I think I'd like, as I said to you in last week's share, as this is all brand new Alshich to me, I've been digging around to find parts of the Alshich I've never seen before, but I certainly want to focus on the personality of Noach in this parsha, who goes from at the beginning Noach ish tzaddik tomim hayod b'rosav, that he was an incredible tzaddik, the only great tzaddik of his generation, to the end, or towards the end of the parsha, when that greatness slips away. And never forget what it says in Pirkei Avos, never be sure of yourself to the day of your death. But there's the element there, or the incident there, that demonstrates that he's plummeted and gone from the highest to the lowest. Let me just tell you that I was once at the bar mitzvah. If I remember rightly, it was the last bar mitzvah, or the last grandson to be bar mitzvah, of the Holy Manchester Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Siegel, Zakasadik Livrocha, who I had the great privilege, um, uh, and really it was a unique experience to be close to, if that's the right word. And at this event, at this family simcha, he talked to his bar mitzvah grandson and pointed out that he's wearing tefillin for the first time. Part of our halachic tradition when it comes to tefillin is, of course, in the Shel Rosh, there is four parshias, four little scrolls of parchment with various psukim from the Torah, and they're rolled into parchment and they're secured by taking the hair from the tail of an ox, which apparently is quite wiry, and they wrap it round it. And he said, why is it that it's secured with this particular hair from this particular animal? And he said, very interestingly, of course, when you're wearing tefillin, you have to, and the halacha is quite clear about this, you have to be careful that no negative thoughts, certainly no forbidden thoughts, enter your mind. It's a very special moment, a holy moment, or holy time. So be very careful what comes into your mind when you're wearing tefillin. But at the same time, when you're at the highest level, as a consequence of concentrating and making sure no negative thoughts appear in your mind, don't forget the tefillin that you're wearing, the parshias, the little scrolls, are secured with the hair that comes from the tail of an ox. The reason is to remind you of the golden calf. When the Jewish people were at the highest possible spiritual level, when they stood at Mount Sinai, when they said Nasa v'nishma, and then after that, the mistake, the miscalculation, although the Kabbalah Bible says it was an intentional, at least a subconscious intentional miscalculation about the date for Moshe's return. They assume he's disappeared, he's gone. They panic and they make the golden calf. But the point that Manchester Rosh said to his grandson was, you've got to be very careful because at the moment of the greatest heights, you can come tumbling down. And again, to echo the words of Pirkei Avos, never be sure of yourself to the day of your death. And so we turn to the Parsha in Noach. So the Parsha in Noach, or the part of the Parsha of Noach, when it talks about this, I'll take my glasses off so I can see this properly. One gets to a certain age. Then they come out of the ark. So this is in a test, Perik Test, chapter 9. If you're using I usually use the little art scroll here, so you can see the English translation. And page 42, that's in page 42, and it's in Pasuk 20, so 9:20. No, I was looking to see if by some miracle it was 9:20 in the clock, but it's not. But stranger things have happened. Anyway, so it says, what happens? Let's find the place. Oh, good. So is it 20 or 21? Yes, 20. V'yochel Noach ish ha'adama, and Noach, the man of the earth, v'yochel. What does v'yochel mean? Rashi says, maybe read to you the Rashi. V'yochel also atzma chulin. He made himself profane. He made himself ordinary. Now, this was a man who was just a few moments ago. His story up till now has been incredibly heroic. He is a prophet. God speaks to him. That's the highest spiritual level a person can reach. And now he makes himself ordinary. It's quite a scary thought. Imagine reaching the greatest heights and then through your choices becoming a very mundane person. I suppose the psychological damage to somebody who was a multimillionaire and loses the money overnight, and incidentally, I've met several such people. The barber shop, which I used to have my hair cut in Manchester, I remember the first time I was sitting in the chair, the barber was snipping away, and in came a fellow wearing a pullover, a jumper with a hole in the elbow. He had a dog with him. The dog was attached by a string, and he sat there chatting. Incidentally, barbershops always have people who wander in to sort of like waste the time of day. And after 10 minutes, they went out, and the barber told me, he used to drive a Rolls Royce. That fellow used to drive a Rolls Royce. I've known many people of that. But the psychological damage of being incredibly rich and then losing everything must be horrific. But imagine, that's only money. And I mean that seriously. That's only money. But imagine you were a great person. Imagine you're a great spiritual person, and then you become only ordinary. Just only ordinary. I don't know how you deal with that. I don't know how you deal with that. Anyway, Rashi says, he made himself ordinary. B'yochel, the word b'yochel, from the word chulin, to be ordinary, chol, ordinary. Also, outside chulin, shohei lo la'asik techila b'nisacheres. What's the first thing he's doing is planting grapes? Wheat, corn, barley, important stuff, potatoes. Well, I know they don't have potatoes, but come from Scotland um, with Irish ancestry as well. I think I can say I have a certain, and living in America, which is where I believe they come from in the first place, well, I have a certain affection for potatoes. But leaving that totally aside, there are more important things to plant than grapes. But this is his first choice. And so the Pasuk condemns him. And then it says, we'll go through it a little bit more. It says, then he says, again, V'yochel Noach 20, V'yochel Noach ish adama v'yita korem. So the first thing he plants is korem, a vineyard. V'yisht min hayayin, and he drinks from the wine. Really? Thought he just planted a vineyard. Oh, that's grapes. He plants vines. Well, they take a while to grow, don't they? And then they have to be matured, and then they have to be squished, and then the grape juice has to be left to ferment. And then after, what, 3 years perhaps? Then you will have wine which has got an alcoholic content, an alcoholic fraction. And then, suddenly, he planted it, suddenly he's drinking. What's going on here? And he becomes drunk. And Vizgael. Now, if you're good at Hebrew, you'll know the usual translation of that. Let's see how they translate this over here. So one of the great things of joys of having the art scroll is to see how they translate it when the Alshich disagrees. It's very unfair. The Alshich is, the art scroll is excellent. It's just there are many different ways to translate things, but this gives us at least a nice contrast and comparison. And so if I look at 20, it's 22, I think. Yeah, 21, sorry. He drank of the wine and became drunk. And he uncovered himself, yes. And he uncovered good, that's the right translation. And he uncovered himself. Not he was uncovered. The idea of sort of like a drunk, takes off his clothes, doesn't know what he's doing, he's lying there naked. But he uncovered himself is suggests, and I won't go take you too deeply into that sort of area. It was sexual promiscuity. It was a sign of sexual promiscuity, which, of course, as anybody knows, drunkenness often causes. Okay, that's all we're going to look at, and let's just immediately turn to the Alshich. And tonight we're going to add to the Alshich Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Rambam, and then the Alshich himself, but not the Alshich in his commentary on the Chumash, but just for a glimpse, the Alshich's Shilas and Shuvas. We have Baruch Hashem. We know the Alshich wrote a parish on the whole of the Talmud, which is lost or is probably sitting in some Vatican vault somewhere, confiscated and censored. However, we do have the Shilas and Shuvas of the Alshich, or at least some of them. And the Alshich, let me remind you, was the Av Beis of Sfas, a Talmud of Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, got smicha from Rabbi Yosef Karo, and was the Av Beis. So you would expect to see his halachic rulings, or some of them, to have survived. And I'll tell you, I'll refer back to that very shortly. But let's turn to the Alshich, and it's not his usual style. We don't have we're not going at the beginning of the parsha where he asks lots of questions. We're going to go straight in, but he's going to take us in, as he often does, into the midrashic and indeed Kabbalistic insights as to what's going on here. I'm going to read to you quite a lot, and then we'll take it and make it very, very much applicable to our age at our time. Uh, but I was tempted to let the cat out of the bag there. I shan't. Okay, so here we go. V'yochel Noach ish ha'adama. So Noach became ordinary, is my translation. Omer ki hakol hoylech ach kavonas apoil. It's said, says the Alshich, establishing an important principle, everything goes after the intention of the person who carries out the work. Do you intend to make a good building, to build something well, to create something well, and consequently do? Or if the thing that you produced was not so good, it's because you didn't actually have the intention to produce something really very good to begin with. Also, it depends. What did you have in mind at the beginning? All depends on the builder or the designer, what he's got in mind. Because you should know when it comes to wine, when it comes to alcohol, there's an aspect to it which is heavenly, which is holy. And this is a very, very important point. Somebody called the Bear Yosef, he says, and it's a very interesting thing. I think I've shared this with you before in some of my shirim, maybe from last year and maybe other shirim that are not Alshich based. But the Bear Yosef says an incredibly interesting thing. When I first saw this, I was deeply suspicious because he used a generalization. And as you probably know, as a rule, if I can make a generalization, and generalizations are an extremely dangerous thing. To say that all Scotsmen, I happen to pluck that as a completely random example, wear kilts is obviously nonsense. You can't see if I'm wearing a kilt or not, of course, because I'm sitting down, but I can assure you I'm not. So not all Scotsmen wear kilts, and not all Muslims are, extremists who want to blow people up, and not all Americans are superficial, and whatever generalizations and stereotypes, national stereotypes that people come up with. They are generalizations, and obviously a generalization is by definition flawed. And when I saw in the Bear Yosef, it says an incredibly interesting thing, but it was a generalization, which, as it were, um, did not appeal to me, at least initially. And that was, he said, when the non-Jewish world wants to come close to the divine, wants to come close to the spiritual, to God, then they tend to do so by disengaging from aspects of the physical, the material world. Whereas that's not the case by Judaism. But he said when when the non-Jewish world as a whole wants to attain spiritual heights, they do so by denying the mundane, the earthly. And as I say, my knee-jerk reaction was to be suspicious of that. But the more I started to examine it, the more I started to challenge it, the more I had to agree that he was right. After all, if you consider the sexual side of life, um, uh, sexual love, um, progeny producing the next generation, well, of course, in the Christian tradition, that it's all often held up as a great thing to aim for is celibacy, to be cut off from male and female partnerships, and marriage and children and bringing up families. Hermits are seen as holy people. Priests in the Catholic tradition, and at least, are aimed for celibacy. Nuns and monks, celibate for the rest of their lives in convents or in monasteries. In Islam, then of course alcohol is banned. You cut yourself off from alcohol, and so on and so forth. And the more I thought about it, the more I found that to be true. In Judaism, certainly there are times when we cut ourselves off from the pleasures of this world, including the sexual side of life, which is cut off during the period of Nida, of course, as we all know, for about 12 days of the month. But it's not cut off entirely. And all the pleasures, the physical pleasures of this world, are permitted because it can be used for a holy purpose. That's why God created it in the first place. And so too when it comes to wine. That's very true when it comes to wine and alcohol. The Pasuk says, we'll talk about this shortly, the Pasuk says that wine gladdens a man's heart. So it can be godly, it can be uh, spiritually uplifting. So we don't cut ourselves off from these things, but we limit. But we limit. This we will come back to very shortly. Let me go back to reading to you. V'yesh bechinas, there is a part of this. Wine is yesh bechinas shemayim. The wine has a holy element to it. V'yesh bechinas givorim, l'shtos yain limsach secher. But there is an aspect to it where it is quite the opposite, whether it's wine or other strong drinks, whiskey, vodka, etc., brandy. And as I live in America, I suppose I should say bourbon. Anyway, Shahul Haskolos called Dover Rakenoida, which is the beginning of every bad thing. I can't remember where that figure, where the statistic came from that I've got popping about in my mind as we talk, but I think the vast majority of acts of violence are alcohol based or started by alcohol because as a drug, alcohol is a disinhibitor, which is why you get the almost comic picture of the tiny little fellow squaring up to the fellow 6'4". Of course, he's drunk and he's quite convinced that he's going to be able to defeat this Og Melech Haboshen or Sichain, giants of that ilk, and of course he's not. But anyway, but he says that alcohol, when it's used wrongly, it has a negative context. Apart from the heavenly one, it has a hellish one, I suppose you might say, and that's why it's a coin with two faces. Scholars called over Irakanoida. Omar ki Noach gam ki kol yibotzim imena kavonas l'teva. There's no doubt at all that there was an element, this great tzaddik, the prophet, when he planted the grapes and the vineyard first, obviously his mind was, because that's more important than potatoes, and that's more important than rhubarb, and that's more important than corn and wheat, etc. Because of that, I can use it for a godly purpose, to be sameach, etc., etc. That's obviously the case. However, there was a negative element there too. He says, "Ki lo yivotzim imena kavanas l'toiba im kol zeh techila machshavasei lo yasel rak al bechinas chamaris." But the catalyst for that thought, even though it can be used positively, was that he was attracted to the negative use of alcohol. That's why it says Noach, the man of the earth. He called Haskalas of Bereshis the Inyan and Moshe Hoya al Bechinas Ayesa Ish Adama Chamori. It's telling the beginning of this whole planting the vineyard stuff was because he was the physicality, an Ish Chaimer. It was the material and physical desires of this world that was the real trigger, the critical factor in making the choice to make that the first crop that he sowed. And that's why he sowed that vineyard. Okay. Balkin. So that says, he goes on, and now he drinks from the strong one. It's not that he intended to use the wine for holy purposes, or as the Gemara says in Erevin, wine also can be a comfort to people. You give wine to people who are availing, who are going through the purpose, the concept of avelus, the process of avelus, of mourning. Leonis Minayan, to give them, to increase their comfort level. Key im kol iker hoyolishtas minayin. Well, he really wanted to drink wine. Al kain bought a kolab kamam razal, and that's why it therefore ended up with a tragic conclusion. Haroy setable navala yaze atzmi minayin. As it says famously in the Parsha of Nozer, if you see a woman who is accused of being a saita, and the whole process, and the idea is, as the Gemara says there, and Rashi cites that, it could only have been that she did such a thing because she got drunk, and therefore you should go in the opposite direction. So he was aware, and one is aware of the negative aspect of it. You should be very, very wary of it, but he wasn't sufficiently wary of it. Ki hayayin boiged o maybe zima. Because a yayin, it betrays you. It's a traitor. It betrays you. It seems jolly, nice, but it soon betrays you to do stuff which is extraordinarily bad and extraordinarily not good. So therefore, Bola Asas Boy Zima Ki Yizgal, as we said, he reveals himself, he literally As they say in the vernacular, people end up in courts because they revealed their nakedness. And then that's why Cham sees him being naked, etc. And then either the son, forgive this, it's horrible, but that's because I'll say he actually sodomized, he raped his father, or he actually, according to another opinion, saw his nakedness, he actually made sure he would never have any more children. And we won't go any further into that one. And it says the Alshich now. And that's why Chazal say in Bereshis Rabbo. Now he quotes the Midrash Rabbo, and it says the following thing. At the moment, at the point, now it's a Midrash, so therefore we're going into more Kabbalistic areas. At the moment when Noach went to come to plant the vineyard, Ifka be Shida Shimadon, then a shade, a demon called Shimadon, that's got a name, came to him. Omerloi, Shufti and Cho, let me become a partner with you in this process. Elazdarz v'cho doloti tiul lechelkai, im also lechelkai ana achabla b'cho. But be careful. I'll be a partner with you in this process, but be careful not to encroach on my aspect of this process that we're going to become partners in, the production of wine, the production of alcohol. Because if you do, I'll punish you. Interesting, enigmatic medrash, to put it mildly. But you're talking Kabbalah and the Alshich says, and it's possible. Shall Yoda Nasas Koichas Kedusha. Indeed, that he intends that therefore it seems to be the Noach, he wants wine for holy purposes. And then this demon, we'll see that another version in a second says it's actually the Satan, wants it for negative purposes. He said, well, okay, be careful not to get in my side of the come to my side of the town or my side of the vineyard, because it will be very detrimental to you. Ki em yain harishus. And what does the detrimental use of alcohol refer to? So the phrase in Hebrew is yain harishus, which we would say in today's terminology, recreational drinking, like recreational drugs. I always think, incidentally, that phrase is such a lie. It's not recreation, recreate. In my experience, people who can use alcohol very soon find they're not recreating anything except it's rather they're creating, and they're creating a lot of trouble for themselves. And that's the idea here. So he says, Ki'im el yain rishus, because if you use wine for recreational purposes, wine for its effect, drunkenness, then then you will indeed be creating demons for yourself. And that's hinted at in this demon story here. But because when he wanted to do it, it hints at the fact that he was interested in the drunken aspect of wine, the inebriation that it can cause. And when he says, that aspect of drink, of alcohol, I'll partner with you in that. And as there is the Lord the citizen Rishus, fine, but make sure that you keep your consumption of alcohol to, and we'll see more about this in a second, to be something which is constructive and helps you in being an Eved Hashem. Somebody wants, a Jew who wants, male or female, who wants to connect to Hashem. So a bit of alcohol, not too much. And the Alshich is going to express enlarge on this in a second. So we've just got, it's not a long Alshich tonight, but it's because it's not a long Alshich we'll get into it. I think I'll allow myself to carry on reading to you if you don't mind. Inza, he says, and a similar way of looking at that is Ki Omer of Sinazal, the Gemara says in Erevin, Lo Nivra Yain, Elalachil Hashem, Esheko Zechosefim Ba'olamazeh. Very interesting Gemara in Erevin. Gemara in Erevin is in Samach Hei Omad Aleph, and it says, I'll read that again, Hashem did not create wine, Elalachil Hashem, Skar Zechosehem Ba'olamazeh. In order to give reward to Rishonim for any good things they have done, or even any good things they've done accidentally as a consequence of their bad things, God's not going to give them reward for it in heaven, so they can have the reward in this world. What's the reward? Alcohol. Being a drunk. Interesting. And that's why there's a posuk which says, he gives reward to the people who are lost. Lost, as it were, they've lost the world to come. The Gam, the Nachem, the Venim, and the Gemara also can say, or the positive side, it can also be good in order in offering comfort to those who are mourning or sitting Shiva. The Yain Lama Nashi to the Lamori Nashi to those who get. This is a posuk, incidentally, Mishli, um, and wine is good for giving reward to the bad guys in this world or to comfort people who are brokenhearted. And I think, says the Alshich, I think, Shalom nitin lahem b'scharam. It doesn't make any sense. That's the reward to get them drunk. No. Ela b'mnei habiyim larisha. No, because I'm giving them a vehicle for them to carry out their wickedness. And in fact, what they want is itself going to be the punishment. If you know anything about alcoholism and alcoholics, then indeed what they got themselves involved in is the idea of somebody going to hell and then the devils that they created who were stabbing them with pitchforks and all that sort of iconography. It also says that's quite real when it comes to alcohol abuse. You abuse alcohol, and alcohol takes control of you. You become an alcoholic, and that itself is your punishment. It's, I suppose, a mida keneged mida. It was a quintessential mida keneged mida, measure for measure. What you did wrong, that itself becomes your punisher. Shahar yain yosef, because you drank too much wine. Ke'ina haroy is cited in the bill, as we said before. You should have run away from wine. You saw the negative aspects from it, but you embraced it. There's a bit of wine which is a chelik l'Hashem, and a bit of wine which is a chelik of the Satan, and that's drunkenness. So wine which is used to gladden the heart, and the Gemara says that, it's there for gladdening the heart. The Rambam, which we'll come to in a second, talks about this. Halachically, when it should be used like in a simcha, like simchas Torah, a little bit of wine, if it gladdens the heart. But when it starts to become drunkenness, and there's a clear distinction, people know, when they're drinking, I enjoy being Scottish, single malt whiskey very much, the taste. As soon as I start to feel it affecting me, that's enough, and I've stopped. That's okay. But when you go beyond that, and the awareness of it starting to affect you physically is compounded by the fact you drink more and more and more, that's not okay. That's the bit of the vineyard owned by either the demon in the Midrash Rabbo or in this Gemara, then, as the Alshich says, the Satan himself. Okay. Omer loy hasatan shtufi imcho ki bienu yesh lecha shutfas. So the Alshich's version is that it wasn't he's quoting another Midrash, but it's not actually a demon, but this was the Sultan himself. And now he goes on to say a little bit more. And so he quotes here, and this bit is very interesting in its own right. Zu bo lefi hanusach hazeh shel Midrash Rabbo. That's the version we have in the Midrash Rabbo, which we've talked about before. Aber be Midrash Avkir, I think it's Avkir. There's a Midrash called Avkir. What's the Midrash Avkir? So I looked it up before because I had never come across this. Remember, new Alshich, and apparently it's a Midrash of which is mostly lost, but elements of it are quoted in the Alkut Shmoni and the Midrash Tanchuma. And apparently that is, you can find this in the Tanchuma Nun Ches Yud Gimel. So in the Midrash Tanchuma, which we do have in its entirety, quotes elements from a Midrash manuscripts which we have lost, probably again in the Vatican. So he says, Nusach Oihel Rizal, Acher Rizal, this is how Chazal say it, Vayito Kerem, Bal Likros Satan. So here's a different version of the story we talked about when he went to plant the vineyard. The first version was he met a demon. Second version is he meets the Satan himself. And listen to this, I think this is quite interesting. He said, so he meets the Satan, going around the road, or what that means. Balakrois the son, so how about if you and I plant this vineyard? How about we become partners in this? Great idea. Miyad hoba baracholo achas. Listen to that, interesting. At that point, he brings a ewe and the shochta ala geffen. So they plant the grapes. We'll see in a second how the grapes appear instantaneously. And then he takes a ewe and he cuts the throat of the ewe, and the blood pours onto the grapes. Achakach hevi ari, and after that he brings an ari, he brings a lion, one lion. The shochta al geffen, so the Sultan then shechts. slaughters the lion, and the lion's blood falls on the grapes. Bacha chazir, and after that he brings a pig, b'shochad al isa geffen, and he pours the blood from the pig on the grapes. B'minei ma asakim. I thought, why did the Sultan do that? What's the point of that? Because so listen to this. The idea is when a man drinks, and this is what we were hinting at before, or I was mentioning before, when a man drinks one, oh, incidentally, factually, you might be interested to know the halacha is much more strict about women drinking alcohol, very much more restrictive, and it says they shouldn't effectively. And the reason is that women get drunk twice as quickly as men. And the reason for that is that the enzyme that breaks down alcohol in the stomach, men produce twice as much as that as women. And consequently, they can drink twice as much alcohol without it affecting them as women can. So therefore, women, incidentally, Japanese, interesting, very interesting thing. There's a physiological difference. Japanese people are also extremely susceptible, more susceptible than other peoples to the effects of alcohol. I mean, physiologically, they're much more vulnerable to that. But here's what the Midrash says here. Ma also Cain has Sultan. The Midrash Tanchim. Why is it the Sultan said did these things, slaughtered these three animals? Because when a man drinks the first cup, who can rochela enov shvela roch? Then he's gentle like a ewe lamb, like a female sheep, very gentle and timid. One cup of wine, and maybe that will help him to overcome his shyness, etc. But okay, because she was choices. But when he drinks 2 cups of wine, miyad nasa giber kaori, then there's a transformation. Now the alcohol is kicked in. As I said before, you can tell the difference yourself. However, here's a nice picture to help you get the idea. You've had 2 cups of wine, suddenly it's and you can take on the world. Go back to my midget trying to fight with my giant from a few moments before. Masculadaba Gavura is he starts to speak Gavuras. I can do this. I can be anybody. And me Kamani, who's like me? This is taking me back to my boyhood in Glasgow. You could find people living examples of this every weekend, lying all over the streets. Bekashu shoysa shlosha or arba. But if you go on and you drink 3 or 4 cups of wine, then what happens then? You're like a chazir. So the first you're as gentle as a lamb, then suddenly you're the lion, and then you're a pig. And you're lying there, and I'll read to you what he says. Then Shemislachlach Batit, you're lying in the mud, or lying in your own excrement. Repes, you're filthy, and you've urinated in yourself. So therefore, ask the obvious question. But this prophet, this Noach, this tzaddik, how and why would he want to be in? Like, take this literally, or an insight into his psychology. Why would he want to play with fire and get into a partnership with this guy? When he says to him, let's be partners in this, and he said, sure thing. And the answer is, and why did he bring these 3 animals? On that day he planted it, and that day he drank the wine, which is an impossibility. A grape doesn't grow in a day, doesn't mature in a day, doesn't produce wine in a day. And how could that be? Because he wanted to produce wine. And he didn't want to wait 1 or 2 years for the grapes to mature. Therefore, he wanted grapes that would produce wine straight away. Why? Because his real desire, even though it can be used for mitzvahs, but his real desire was to the effect of it, and he wanted the effect of it straight away. Okay, and Omerloy Hasotan, Sotan Sedra, Sonkashin, Natana, no, Yachad, Bo'open, to Maher La'asaspri. Okay, and if that's what you want, then partner with me. I'm an angel. I can make that happen for you. I can make it as soon as we plant these grapes in the ground, the seeds will suddenly become like one of these time-lapsed cameras where you see the growth. It'll all happen in an instant. You want your wine? Partner with me. You'll get the wine. Well, of course, that's what he did want. Did this literally happen? I don't know. But it's giving you an insight into the man. But this was a great man. This had been a great man. A man that the likes of whom you and I probably could never, until now, what's the phrase? Tie his shoelace, something like this. But anyway, let's read on a little bit further, and then we're going to go off in a slightly different direction. And so he says, Ba'ofen tomorrow la asas bri, Omer Lohem, fine, Baal Kain, Bo, Bayom Shanota, Bayom Bishos. That's why I was able to drink it the same day. But her like Yayain, Siasus not a very. And it's because wine is a Sisura de Bavera. It's the facilitator. It's the go-between. It's the person who negotiates, as it were, to allow wine to do its bad stuff. In shechting these animals, it's obvious that the nature that we talked about before was going to be now ingrained, as it were, in the DNA of the grape, right? It'll start off by being a nice little cup of wine, very nice, and the shy person becomes a little bit more relaxed and maybe can make conversation where he couldn't before when he was tongue-tied. And now, after a couple of cups, now he considers himself to be, um, Mike Tyson, if you've ever heard of him, famous black boxer. And then after that, then he just lies in the ground and becomes a pig. Okay, that's what we're going to look at the Alshich there. But I want to stay with this concept. I stay with this concept because actually it's something I feel quite strongly about. And in America, and I don't know if in England anymore, because I've not, I've been gone for 10 years. I've never actually thought about this. But certainly in America, it's very common to have Kiddush clubs in shul. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not it's a good idea to disappear from the middle of davening to imbibe alcohol. And I suppose you could argue that even if people don't get drunk, you're missing out and listening at least to the Haftarah, which is how I think this stuff works. But certainly, it's become extremely fashionable for people to do that. But it's also, as we've just seen, extraordinarily dangerous. Because this is really the territory of the other side of the vineyard we talked about before. A little bit of wine, although it tends to be whiskies, a little bit of wine or a little bit of whiskey is perfectly okay. But too much, there's a danger in that. Now, this is something which the Rambam actually says. So let's turn to the Rambam. And so we've got the Rambam Mishnah Torah, Hilchos Yom Tov. You'll find that in Zmanim, the book of Zmanim. And if you look at Perik Vov and Posuk Kov, because when a person drinks and eats when it comes to Yom Tov, to a Jewish festival, lo yamshich b'yayin, don't drink too much wine. Abschak bekalas rosh v'yom shekol mi sheyosef b'zeh yabem b'mitzvah simcha. Shashikras v'shokak harba bekalas rosh ena simcha ela cholalos. V'sichlus, because too much drinking, which leads you to be or to be drunk, that leads to all sorts of terrible things. And the Rambam goes on to say that if it's in order to bring a little bit, same with the idea as before, a little bit of wine to bring you to a little bit of relaxation, fine. But when it starts to actually physically affect you, and you turn from the you into the lion, or the self-appointed lion, then it becomes extraordinarily dangerous. And then I wondered, as this is a halacha, as the halacha discusses this, did the Alshich discuss this in any of his shilas and shuvas? So there I was able to go through before, in the hope that the philosophical, albeit with Kabbalah and Midrashim and stuff, but the ideas the Alshich has certainly expressed in his commentary on the Chumash. Wouldn't it be interesting if in his shilas and shuvas, and the Alshich talks about that here? No, I can't claim to have gone through this exhaustively, far from it. But I certainly went through at the back all the sources to see if there's a possibility. I did not find it, which is a little bit upsetting. It would be very nice if the Alshich actually then paskin that as a dayan. But the greatest halakhic authority in America in the 20th century was, of course, Moshe Feinstein. It's like a tzaddik kodesh lebracha. And there's a famous tshuva. It's a very small tshuva here. Can you see it? It's there. All that there. And this is, those of you who are Rabbonim who listen to this in Talmud Chomim will probably know exactly what I'm going to quote. It's Nuri Dia Chelik Hey, sorry, Chelik Gimel, and it's Halacha Lamed Lamed Hey. Oh, my light's gone off. I've gone a bit darker. Hold on, see if I can adjust that a little bit. Make it a little bit brighter. Sorry, I've got light which is supposed to shine here. Let me read to where Moshe Feinstein says. It's not the subject. The question is the Shaila is asking is called Iser Ishon Samim, the idea of smoking drugs. Smoking drugs. Okay. Somebody asked them that question. Marijuana, etc. Hine bedover asher hischelo eze bechorim me yeshivas la'asim hashish. The question apparently he said some boys in yeshivas have started to smoke hashish, and in brackets marijuana, marijuana. Poshachu dover oser mekama ikri dinim. It's obvious that drug is completely forbidden for many, many reasons. In the Torah, first of all, it's physically injurious, and fine. But if you find some very healthy people that it doesn't help, we're not obviously, he's not talking here about medical marijuana, which is used, with a medical prescription, not in the gas station in the corner, but literally to help people with terrible pain relief. That would be a different question. He was not addressing that. But he's talking about it's used for recreational drugs, like recreational alcohol we were talking about before. Who is a das, leaving aside the effect, that the physical effect, for those who are not massively physically affected by it, but they're mentally affected by it. It's detrimental, it's injurious to the clarity and their ability to think. And after all, the Shiloh was about boys smoking marijuana in yeshiva. המקלקל אסס דס, והנה יכולים להבחין דור בלאשורי, שזה אויד יוסר חמור שלבד שמונה עצמה למנתר. And that's much worse, he says. The psychological damage, the intellectual damage is much worse. I must, if you forgive me, how we're doing for time. Yes, I can quickly tell you the story. There is somebody who was very close to me, a young lady, who was very close to my late wife and I. And we'd known her for a long, long time. And I became, she appointed me to be her rabbi through her many years of association with us. And then she moved to Eretz Yisrael. And I told her, no, I can't be your rabbi when you move to Eretz Yisrael. For the very simple reason is that it's a different world and different society, different norms. And I never learned, I visited there many, many times and stayed there for months at a time, but I'd never lived there. So I don't have the expertise to advise you properly. You need to get your own rabbi. But she never managed to get her own rabbi. And she said, I can't. And Shidduchim, which she was looking for, was looking to get married, the kid come up, several had come up. She needed somebody to check them out on her behalf. I said, okay. So I phoned up the rabbi of the boy in his yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva of a boy in a certain yeshiva, Baal Tshuva yeshiva. The girl was a Balas Tshuva, and asked questions about the boy. And as an aside, I should tell you that generally you have to ask the right questions, or you won't get the right answers. You have to know how to ask the question. Anyway, so I said, is he a nice boy? And the rabbi said, yes. And is he a kind boy? And yes, etc., etc. Does he learn? Yes. Can he learn? Now that in rabbinic circles, as you probably know, means can he learn Gemara? It's just say, can you learn? To learn really means can you learn Gemara? And he hesitated for just a split second. But I, having done quite a lot of this, caught that hesitation and said, I see you hesitated. So well, he prefers to learn halacha rather than Gemara. And I kind of guessed where we were going with this when I said, why? And unsurprisingly, he said, well, before he was through me, he did lots of drugs, recreational drugs. And he's not got, it has robbed his mental acuity. And he doesn't have, as they say in English, the cop anymore. He doesn't have the mental ability for the sustained concentration that learning Gemara requires. So it certainly affects the mental ability. Drugs certainly affects mental ability. And as Ramesh Feinstein was addressing marijuana, you obviously know that marijuana is called the gateway drug. In other words, it's the gateway to all other drugs as well. So he doesn't address that, but certainly I'll stop. That's something we have to point out. But let's come back to Moshe Feinstein. So he says it's going to affect your intellectual ability. So you're not able to learn Torah and do mitzvahs, and that's much worse. Karai behu menias says egam mit tefillah. You won't be able to daven properly. Mitzvahs Torah asad v'loy dea v'royahu kolam kain. And if you can't concentrate, a drunk person should never daven at the Amud, for example, is the halakha. V'oid not min asher hu garim taibas gedoyla, asher hu yoyse mi taibas achila b'gedoyla. Tzricha la'odam liyos v'yesh lo she'yochel tzamtzam l'havim b'taibasam. And a person can't control his desires. Drugs are disinhibitors, such drugs, and a person's taibas, desires will expand. But who iser chachomer shenema ben sora mora, and that's a very, very serious thing, as it's seen about the Ben Sora Mora. So now Ramosha Feinstein swaps from marijuana and these sorts of drugs to alcohol, that other drug, the one we've been discussing. The story of the Ben Sora Mora is somebody who is a glutton and a drunkard. And that affects his behavior badly. And from that, he's going to go on, as the Torah predicts, to do terrible other things. And if you know any alcoholics, any drunks, um, who were probably, and certainly I know many like this, were actually good people until alcohol got hold of them and turned them into very different kinds of people. That's the story about the Ben Sura and Moira. So the Torah's example that Ramosha Feinstein relates it to is, of course, the Ben Sura and Moira, the drunk. There's no need to go into this. It's obviously forbidden. You're asking, oh, what about alcohol? Obviously forbidden. You're not allowed to get drunk, as the Rambam says, and as the Alshich said here. And even if it's true that there's no halachic prohibition about getting drunk, even still, even if that's the case, over a lav the gam you're going to be like the Ben Sarah Mara, and if nothing else, you're certainly fulfilling being Issa Deraisa of the, as the Rambam says, of Kedoshim Tiyu. You've got to be a holy people, and staggering about and bumping into things and not being able to function as a Jew. That would be the as the Alshich said, from being a great person, you've become ordinary, common, and that itself is a tragedy. So the tragedy of Noach is that he was a great person and he became ordinary. However, there is something more important there. I think it's something which applies to us as well. This is just without any allusion, this is a very straight statement. Alcohol, when it affects you, recreational alcohol, as they say, when it starts to affect you, it's the Satan and Noach. Your side of the vineyard, or at least the side of the vineyard you claim for yourself, that's when it leads to advancing your role as a spiritual person. One glass of wine, one whiskey, or whatever it is that you can safely take without it affecting you. Anything else, it belongs to the Satan. There's nothing more to say. I shall see you next week for our next new insight from the Alshich. Have a very good Shabbos.